Hello everyone, a very good afternoon to all. You're tuning in to our webcast on business and human rights. This is part of a series of webcasts prepared exclusively by Corporate Citizenship for Bursa Sustain, which is a resource by Bursa Malaysia to provide guidance for Malaysian public listed companies to help them on their sustainability journey. Now, previously, we covered topics including materiality and digitalization, and today we focus on another emerging topic within sustainability, which is human rights. Now, you might be asking, how are human rights relevant to businesses? Isn't this something for governments or maybe UN agencies to address? So in the next hour or so, we will unpack the basics of what you need to know about business and human rights, and specifically the business and human rights landscape in Malaysia, the key human rights risks Malaysian companies need to be aware of, and what steps they can take to mitigate these risks. My name is Melissa. I'm from Corporate Citizenship, a global management consultancy on sustainability. And for this discussion today, we have two experts in this field whom I will introduce shortly. Taking a step back, what is human rights? Simply put, human rights is the idea that human beings, regardless of nationality, ethnic origin, race, religion, language, or any other status, should be entitled to a certain level of dignity and respect and have access to the basic things needed for survival. Things like food, water, shelter, and things which accord a human being a certain level of dignity and freedom. Things like the right to safe and healthy working conditions, the right not to be tortured, and so on. But who is responsible for protecting all of these rights? According to international human rights law, it's very clear that it's the government, and they're called the duty bearer of human rights, and they are responsible for protecting the rights of their citizens. So then what does it have to do with businesses? If you look at the screen, you see a list of selected human rights as codified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or UDHR. And this is one of the core documents informing our understanding of human rights today. And as you see, many of these human rights can in fact be very easily impacted in the business environment, either in a positive or negative way. So for example, if I am a business owner and I treat my staff differently based on their ethnicity, I would be violating their right to freedom from discrimination, which is in Article 2 of the UDHR. And if I hire migrant workers who work under forced labor conditions, I would also be violating their rights. And if we open the newspaper today, it's not uncommon to see many of these issues in many parts of the world. For example, pollution of water resources leading to health problems for rural communities. We have land conflicts with ethnic minority groups, poor working conditions in factories, discrimination at the workplace, and so on. So while the states or governments have a duty to protect human rights, there is an increasing recognition that corporates also have a responsibility to respect human rights. And many companies have taken action on this front. They have developed a policy commitment to respect human rights. They have put in place due diligence processes to monitor their operations and mitigate human rights impacts. And lastly, providing remedies if human rights issues do unfortunately occur. And one of the key documents guiding this understanding is called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, or the UNGPs. And this was unanimously agreed upon at the UN level in 2011 to guide companies and governments in understanding their role in protecting and respecting human rights in the business environment. And while it is still a voluntary guide, it's now widely considered a golden standard, and many companies and governments have started to enact plans to bring it to life. For governments, it's in terms of policies and regulations, and for companies, they've also used the UNGPs to guide their own policies and actions. So I recommend a quick read when you have time, and we've included the link below the video. And with that context in mind, we have the privilege of having Mr. Edmund Bon and Dr. Sime to join us in conversation today. Edmund is the head of chambers at AmerBON Associates. As a lawyer, he has extensive experience representing PLCs, MNCs, and governments at all stages of complex business transactions. He provides corporate and strategic litigation advice in particular. And he is a specialist counsel in areas such as land, water, and human rights. And drawing on his unique experience in human rights, Edmund is also the representative of Malaysia to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, or AICHR. And this is a body set up by ASEAN to promote human rights in the region. And I have personally worked with Edmund in the past to promote human rights among the business community in ASEAN, and I can say that he is one of the most passionate and knowledgeable people I know about this subject. Our second speaker is Dr. Simon Lord. He's the Chief Sustainability Officer at Sime Darby Plantation, one of the world's largest palm oil producers and a recognized sustainability leader in Malaysia and beyond. Simon was previously the Director of Sustainability for New Britain Palm Oil and the Director of Research. He began his career with Unilever plc and has over 33 years of experience in the agriculture commodities sector. Now, most of us in the sustainability field are quite familiar with Simon as he is a frequent speaker at forums, sharing his rich experience about sustainability in the agri sector. Thank you both for joining us today.
Hello, thank you for having me.
No problem, Melissa.
Simon and Edmund, most of our listeners are Malaysian PLCs, and some of them might have been practicing sustainability for a while others might have just embarked on this journey. And it seems like environmental issues and corporate governance tends to be better understood compared to human rights, and many companies may still not be entirely clear on their role in respecting human rights. So maybe we can start by taking a step back to understand the Malaysian landscape. And we'll start with Edmund on the broader landscape, and then later to you, Simon, on your experience specifically in agribusiness. Edmund, in your experience, what are some of the most common issues within human rights that Malaysian companies often encounter? Is it, for example, labor issues or land conflict issues? What's your view on that?
Yeah, as a lawyer, I've worked with many companies in the different industries: manufacturing, logistics, oil and gas, palm oil. And just to give an example, we just finished an investigative audit on a large palm oil company. There were allegations that they were employing traffic workers, undocumented migrant workers, and that the working conditions were quite bad. So when we went in, while we have Malaysian law and standards that say you cannot have workers who are trafficked or undocumented workers working on your plantations, yet the company first either turned a blind eye or second said that we do not know because these workers were outsourced to our contractors or subcontractors. So that is one big issue that we see in the palm oil industries and the plantations on the field, because they say, oh, Malaysians don't like to do that kind of job, and there are many opportunities for undocumented migrant workers who need work and need money to work in that kind of industry. So labor supply chain in that sense may not be clean. If you have documented workers who are legally employed, even though they are foreigners, working conditions for them may not be the best. So you have health and safety standards that do not meet even local laws. You have accommodation for them that is not fit for habitation. You have electricity bills being charged to them and deducted unfairly. You see these problems being faced by companies in Malaysia, and it's only the tip of the iceberg. You have manufacturing companies, you have logistic companies, you have oil and gas companies. Their industries and the supply chains may also be facing the similar problems. Yeah, labor and supply chain is huge because every company needs employees, every company needs workers, and it stares in your face when you do your human rights audits and you do your human rights social compliance impact assessments. You see it. But there are other issues which may not stand up in your face when you do an audit. You really have to dig down. So you look at money trail, paper trail, kickbacks being paid to contractors or contractors paying kickbacks to get contracts, gender diversity and inclusivity. For persons living with disabilities, for women. We also talk about the environment. When you process stuff or manufacturing, where does your waste go? Does it pollute the rivers that are next to your factories?
Wow, Edmund, that's a very comprehensive list of issues you've shared with us. Thank you so much for that. Human rights is obviously a very broad topic, and while some issues such as labor rights are relevant across all industries, some are unique to specific industries. So, Simon, maybe you could shed some light on the agricultural sector. What are the specific human rights challenges you face there?
Well, I think human rights weren't necessarily called human rights for most of the plantation sector in the very beginning. They were just called rights. I think most of our focus was originally on community rights, the rights of customary landowners and users of land. because we're intimately involved with operations in remote rural areas, and just about all land is in some shape or form encumbered. And that means that working through free, prior and informed consent to really get communities yea or nay as to whether to proceed with a development has, I think, been one of the fundamental thinkings throughout the whole of the industry. Much of that was encapsulated when the first Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil Standard was produced, in which FPIC featured very strongly. It's continued to be a thread about what we do and how we operate in those communities. I think the other side of human rights, which I think is sometimes forgotten, is it's about also occupational health and safety, not just safety, but also well-being of employees. And that's been a strong point of Malaysian industry through the strong Department of Safety and Health legislation. So those two elements were already there in a lot of the early thinking in plantations.
Thanks, Simon. Edmund, in your role with AICHR and your conversations with Malaysian companies, how aware are Malaysian companies of these human rights risks?
A lot of these issues actually are things that we talk about quite frequently, but if you try and pitch it within a context of human rights, it's very difficult to argue that Malaysian companies have fully accepted the concepts. But Malaysian companies are very well versed with the legal requirements and legal compliance of issues that pertain to their workers, issues that pertain to working conditions, issues that pertain to corrupt practices, money laundering practices. So if you talk about it in very technical details as to what the law entails, yes, I think there is sufficient, and especially for bigger companies, there's sufficient legal knowledge and in fact legal departments that will advise on these issues. But if you say to a company, do you think that you do business that is in accordance or consistent with international human rights standards, then many of them will say, what are these standards? They may say, yes, I see the standards as local Malaysian standards, which may be lower than international human rights standards. And that may not be enough for some of us. It's a good start, but a lot of local and national standards do not necessarily conform or reach the standards of human rights globally that companies should try and strive for.
And Simon, how about you? Any thoughts to add to that now that you've been in Malaysia for a number of years? You've worked previously outside Malaysia, all around the world, and how different is the conversation in Malaysia compared to the West, for example?
I think the conversation has moved quite rapidly, particularly in the palm oil sector, assisted by the RSPO incorporating human rights into a standard of what is sustainability, and that's open the door for people to realize it's not just about the environment, the physical environment, it's about the social landscape as well. I think we're seeing that reflected in the agricultural sector in Malaysia by many more companies choosing to be transparent and to use the Global Reporting Initiative to actually produce what we colloquially refer to as sustainability reports, and Bursa has been, I think, fundamental in enabling that to happen and encouraging that to happen. And so we're actually seeing under the GRI, G4 initiatives, actually aspects of human rights being reported on in a more serious way. And I think this transparency, which has been, if you like, semi-legislated for, becoming a benchmark for good corporate citizens to reflect their approach. I think we're seeing human rights more embedded in our environmental thinking, and so that we realize that the rights of individuals and the rights of community are not in isolation from physical issues. You mentioned earlier to me in a conversation about environmental pollution. that has an impact on communities, it has an impact on individuals, and I think there's a strong link between the environment and people that I think people now are realizing in the corporate world is that you can't just report on one or think about one, you have to think about them together.
Thank you so much. That was very, very helpful. Edmund, now I want to turn to your perspective as a lawyer. We often refer to international human rights standards, such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which is for corporates, and we often refer to them as largely voluntary. So is respecting human rights purely a voluntary exercise, or can it actually be an issue of legal compliance?
Yeah, so if we have a lot of these standards already imbued and stated in Malaysian local law, then failure to comply with these standards will attract civil and criminal liability. One example that is used and frequently is used, many companies know about it, is the Anti-Trafficking in Persons law, as well as in the Immigration Act, where the police or the law enforcement authorities find that your factory is employing undocumented workers or traffic workers or workers who don't have proper legal documents, then the company, which includes the director personally or the factory manager, can actually be charged in court for criminal liability for harboring traffic workers, for breaching immigration law, and there can be fines and sanctions including imprisonment. Then you will have the factory's operations halted because you have just been arrested for basically offences that affect the administration of justice, trafficking and human rights. So not only do you have individuals who may face civil or criminal liability, you have your factory operations that will be halted, so you cannot continue your operations. And third, when people hear about it, for example, if your factory supplies, say, goods to multinational companies in America or in the UK, and people hear that these goods come out from these factories in Malaysia, then you have brand boycotts, and then the companies that you supply these products to will be affected. Malaysia, we are seeing a more educated populace, more discerning consumer, and we cannot take them for granted. And I'm saying that business and human rights is something that we should be really looking into now, as this is going to be the next big thing.
Thanks, Edmund. Yes, in fact, around the world, we're seeing more and more governments enacting legislation on business and human rights. And the most recent one being the Australia Modern Day Slavery Act, which requires large companies to report on the steps taken to reduce the risks of forced labor in their operations and supply chains. Edmund, I understand that Malaysia, while you don't have such a law, and none of the Asian countries do yet, but the Malaysian government is actually working on something called a National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, and the AICHR is actually closely monitoring that process. So could you give us an update on that? What can companies in Malaysia anticipate?
Yeah, so it's very interesting because in 2015, the government had pledged and committed itself to starting the process to draft Malaysia's National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. Globally, there is a push through the UN to have every country draft and map out a National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, which will set out what every government agency, including businesses, needs to do to make sure that the country's business practices and culture comply with human rights. So in 2015, there was some move by the Malaysian government to look into drafting this. Our National Human Rights Institution, Suhakam, has commendably finished its strategic framework on the NAP and has presented it to government. At the recent elections, the new administration came into power, and there is now some time that needs to be taken to look at the few steps that we need to take immediately. So I met the Minister of Law recently, briefed him on NAP, briefed him on business and human rights, and briefed him on Malaysia's commitment and what it entails to fulfill that commitment. He has come back to me to say that we will be working on it together. He's looking into the issues. I have made some recommendations, including looking at a national conference of stakeholders, especially businesses, because we need businesses to come in. It's not a traditional human rights issue to only say government is to implement this, because government can have the laws, but we need businesses, the big players, to come in to implement it. If there's no buy-in from businesses, it's not going to work. So the tripartite model of government, businesses, CSOs have to come into play, and it's slightly different from other traditional human rights issues. So yes, we are taking steps to try and assist the government to have the NAP be drafted as soon as possible. It's going to be very noisy. It's going to be having a lot of inputs and a lot of different views, but we have already gone through this process in many different forums. Globally, it is now time to do it at the Malaysian level so that we are able to level off.
I see. Thanks, Edmund. Yeah, it seems like this is definitely a space to watch. So just to clarify, once this National Action Plan is completed, and I know that it's still in early stages, but once it's completed, what can companies expect? Is it going to be stronger laws, policies?
It may take up to 2 or 3 years to have an NAP. After the NAP is done, laws may need to change. Standards may need to improve. It may need to reach international standards. So in the next 2-3 years or 4 or 5 years, companies have at least some lead time to say, hey, why don't I just reach the standard without having government put it in the NAP and then take another 5 years to implement. So that's one route. The second route is more crude. We can go to the new ministers and try and start advocating and saying, hey, we don't even need a NAP. For this particular issue, let's say migrant workers and their accommodations, we see how many big companies are trying to circumvent the law on giving them accommodation that is cramped, that has no privacy, that has no proper beds. So the laws need to be tightened. So you can become very raw and crude and say, hey, tomorrow the Minister for Human Resources can say for certain industries, you need to immediately tighten the law. He can just change the rules and regulations now if he wants to, if there's political will. If he says, yeah, I've looked at it and it's unfair to the worker. So that is the raw and crude method where he can do it tomorrow, and then companies will just be taken aback and they'll be surprised, and then there'll of course be outcry. But what I'm trying to say is that we will reach, the journey has already started, and we will reach the same result soon, whether it's tomorrow by using the crude method or 5 years time by having an incubator NAP type of process. For companies that have the resources, for companies that value their brand, for companies to ensure that in the long run they are sustainable and responsible business, why not start looking at it now?
Yes, it does seem wise for companies to take note of these upcoming developments. So moving to you, Simon, how does Sime Darby keep watch of these developments, both nationally and globally? And how can companies be more vigilant in this world with rapid developments?
Well, Sime Darby is not dissimilar from any corporate, really, is that all corporates keep a very close watch on what is happening in government. Particularly, we just had a change of government, and what is on the radar in terms of public sentiment. We're all globally connected anyway. But I think for Sime Darby, we no longer see compliance as a fence, that you work towards simple compliance. You have to go beyond compliance if you wish to basically secure the future for your shareholders as well as your stakeholders. I think it's really human rights beyond boundaries, and not just simply going to the boundaries of national legislation You have to look at those initiatives that are going to meet your own definition of sustainability.
Thanks, Simon. Now that we've understood a little more about why companies should care about human rights, let's move on to what they should be doing, learning specifically from Sime Darby's approach. Now, Sime Darby has actually developed a human rights charter outlining their commitment and approach to issues such as forced labor, community and indigenous rights, child rights, and so on. It's also one of the few Malaysian companies with a modern slavery and human trafficking statement. And these are documents which Sime Darby has made public, and so we'll be also including the links for these documents in the video below. So Simon, can you talk us through Sime Darby's journey and how did you get started in the first place?
For us, the journey started around about 2012, was a deeper thinking of what were human rights and how are they expressed or allowed to be expressed within our plantations. I guess nailing the first child policy, which was about child safety, but also child-friendly plantations and child protection and young persons, I think was the first step, and that was about 2013. Subsequently to that, we began work on what does human rights look like inside of our operations. And we pulled together an internal multi-stakeholder task force to actually explore how we set about on this journey. We called it a pathfinder group because we didn't have a roadmap to how we would deliver human rights, and therefore we needed to find the path in order to set our blueprints and our roadmaps in place. From this task force, we worked out where we wanted to go, what our aspirations were, and it's a direct result of that that we produced a very strong human rights charter along the lines of the Ruggie framework. And we were assisted in that thinking by a collaboration with a very good NGO called Shift, which again is John Ruggie's team, which helped give us a heat map of some of the aspects of human rights and potential exploitation issues. At the same time, the RSPO was beginning to come under fire in 2013, and we saw a whole raft of end users, consumer-facing goods, actually talking about what is now referred to as no deforestation, no peat, no exploitation. I think many of those companies put that out. It sounds a very good soundbite, but they didn't have much idea as to how one went about implementing this and measuring the impacts of effectiveness on the ground. As you know, Sime Darby is now a pure play plantations, but at that time we also had other divisions, and because of our connection with the UK, we came under the Modern Day Slavery Act, which was enacted in 2015, and in fact rose to that challenge by producing a modern day slavery. Today we don't have that strong connections with the UK. We have connections with it, but not as strong as we did under our property divisions, but we've still maintained the delivering on a modern day slavery report and indeed update on commitments and targets. So in about 2017, we produced this Human Rights Charter. And it took us that long because we really went into the detail of what it meant. And you're quite right. We've nailed our colours to the mast about providing equal opportunities, freedom of association, eradicating any form of exploitation, ensuring we have favourable working conditions, as well as safety and health, and of course always community and the rights of indigenous people, along with a further expression of protecting the rights of vulnerable people. We incorporated our child protection and the rights of children and brought it up to date by looking at basically violence and sexual harassment. So that really has been our journey. We have more that we've been working on, is that we also recognise that partnerships with NGOs while in a sense go a long way to helping us deliver the Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly Goal 17, which is about partnerships, but the other goals on equity and equality and fair labour practices, we recognised that some of the issues that we were facing were far bigger than a single company. This is when we moved into the next phase, which was to bring together other players in our sector under a pre-competitive collaboration, facilitated and steered by one of our partner organisations, Forum for the Future, itself an NGO, to bring together the stakeholders in a grower-led approach to solving this problem, rather than letting other people approach the problem on our behalf. And that has led to what we can now refer to as a Decent Rural Living Initiative, which for its first phase is looking at how we can strengthen unions as a major stakeholder in internal workforce rights, and particularly through collective bargaining agreements, access to rights information so that there's universal understanding, and indeed looking at how we can use technology to facilitate that. And in addition, it's also looking at what we would say is healthy families, prosperous families, because we realise that just looking at children or just looking at women's issues in isolation didn't help solve some of the problems, but actually realising we employ a spouse and who has a partner, or she has a partner working for our organisation, and that often there is a family associated, that we're an employer of families in that sense, and therefore the well-being of the family as a cohesive unit was actually a way forward to help promote human rights. That is now in its second year, and we've already started to implement action on the ground in Indonesia, while at the same time looking at a whole raft of approaches on the ground here in Malaysia, particularly working with another NGO called Elevate in setting up a hotline which is staffed, really we hope to be 24/7, in the languages appropriate to our foreign workers, so that there is a conduit for them to raise issues of concern, but also effectively to get those issues into the hands of organisations. It's not always easy if you've got a problem in a plantation and you are a simple worker to raise it through management. We recognise there's limitations, but to raise it through a secondary organisation which listens and is able then to give that information into the management to take action is sometimes an easier approach for people to take.
Thank you, Simon. That was a really comprehensive look through your journey. So thanks for sharing. I'd like to maybe turn to the issue of remedies, something we haven't really talked about, but it's a very important aspect of business and human rights. So in cases where human rights violations do occur, what options are available for victims? Who can they turn to, and who do they turn to? Edmund, maybe you can answer this one.
Yeah, so one of the pillars of business and human rights is the responsibility to remedy, to make sure that where we see human rights violations, where we see, for example, workers not being given minimum wage for their salaries, where the law provides for minimum wage, workers are not given social security protection, then the worker must have a place to complain and find his or her remedy. So in countries where there is a working legal system, a court, a labour court, an industrial tribunal, or even a normal civil court, and it works, it's accessible, it's easy to use, then we have a functioning mechanism that will protect and remedy and give compensation to the worker. So in Malaysia, we have functioning courts, we have good tribunals, we have also National Human Rights Institution, SUHAKAM, to go to. We have our Public Complaints Bureau that can give this kind of binding remedies. So at least we have that still working in Malaysia. But before we even want to go there, what we try and normally advocate for is that the company itself should have a grievance mechanism. The company should allow, for example, on working conditions for workers, a hotline by WhatsApp or SMS or phone that can be used to make these complaints and try and find remedies. Of course, the power equation is another issue, because a lot of workers, especially migrant workers who come in and work in the factories and plantations, are very afraid of the employers. They will always not want to speak out for fear that they either get less work or they get less pay or they get further discrimination in their work. So while having mechanisms, these mechanisms must also be accessible and effective mechanisms. A company cannot just say, yeah, I have a hotline, I have SMS, but nobody uses it. Then your audit will look into why is nobody using it. And then when the workers say, oh, I'm not going to use it because every time I use it, I have the mandor that's going to come to me and going to shout at me for making a complaint that I don't have a fan in the room, or the fan has broken down, or I don't have a proper bed. So if you don't have that internal mechanisms, then the worker should have the right to look for mechanisms outside the company. But a lot of issues, for example, if you don't have proper ventilation, or you don't have light at night, or you don't have food, these are issues that are too cumbersome to always bring to the courts. So this grievance mechanism within companies, run by companies, must be functioning mechanisms.
Thanks, Edmund. Yes, it does sound like companies should set up corporate grievance mechanisms, which allows them to address human rights concerns internally before these cases escalate to external institutions such as Suhakam or even the courts. Right, I think we have time for just one last question, which is a broad one. So what advice would you both give to companies who ask what is the one thing they can do to start their journey on human rights? Because all these steps that we've talked about, including Sime Darby's approach, it seems very comprehensive, and it might be a little bit overwhelming for companies which are new to this. So what is the first step companies can take, and how would you advise them? Simon?
I think it's very simple. Get the conversation going in your organization. Don't say, oh, it's very big, we're not going to do this, or cannotla. Instead of cannotla, start talking about canla, and actually tackle this head on. I don't mean like a bulldozer, it's sensitive issues. Don't say it's some other department's responsibility. I don't care which department you're in. This is not the preserve of a sustainability or a environmental or safety or health department. This is something that any department can take the lead on. Of course, it really helps to get commitment from the top and to get it discussed at the board level, because once the board gets on board, literally, then you see movement happening.
And how about you, Edmund? How would you advise companies on the first steps they can take to minimize their human rights risks and impacts?
For bigger companies, I already see that it's being done, because you have basically legal departments, human resource departments, and compliance departments. So the first thing to do is try and consolidate and look into what are the key challenges that the company faces. Are all the laws regarding labor, sustainability, environment, anti-corrupt practices, are all these laws already being implemented internally in a way that is good, is effective? Do you have workers who are actually complaining about how things are being run, or the culture of the company? So do that kind of assessment first. My fear or my challenge that I normally see is really working with companies that are not big, companies that are smaller, companies that are more family run, companies that do not have specific specialized compliance departments or offices. So these companies, because they are smaller, will say, hey, this is something that's not too important for me. What's important is I can get out my operations and I can get out my products on a regular basis every day. But my supply chain, I'll just close one eye to make sure that things are done efficiently and quickly, without trying to fuss over the supply chain issues. And a lot of the businesses in Malaysia are SMEs. And when they're SMEs, then the regulation for a lot of the SMEs are slightly less formal as opposed to the bigger companies. So to answer the question, I think the first thing really is to do this human rights assessment, social compliance assessment, first at the level of what local law, what Malaysian law says, and then at a level that's slightly higher. What does international law says? What does, for example, the Migrant Workers Convention say? What does the UN Anti-Discrimination Against Women say? And see whether the company wants to comply with a standard that's much higher than local Malaysian law.
Thanks, Edmund. Thanks, Simon. Thank you both for sharing your insights. Human rights is definitely a fascinating topic, and it covers many, wide range of issues, but I'm afraid I think that's all the time we have today.
Thank you, Melissa and Simon.
And well, thank you very much, Melissa, and you too, Edmund. I've really enjoyed having such a frank and open discussion, and I'd just like to thank you for giving us the opportunity for Sime, Darby, Plantations to actually talk about human rights and what it means for us. Thank you.
Thank you for your time. Okay, bye.